The sun hung low over the Montana plains that evening, and Thomas McNally sat quiet on his weathered porch, watching the light turn everything golden. He was 62 years old with hands that knew hard work, and a heart that had learned both joy and sorrow through the seasons of his life. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, and every fence post and water trough held memories he carried like precious stones in his pocket. Thomas had never married, and that was a choice he'd made long ago, though sometimes in the quiet hours he wondered about the roads not taken. But the land had been enough, and the cattle had been enough, and the simple rhythm of seasons had filled his days with purpose. He was known throughout the county as a fair man, and a quiet one who kept his word and helped his neighbors without being asked. That afternoon had been particularly long. 2 of his hired hands had quit without notice, leaving him short during the busiest time of year, when the herds needed moving to higher pasture. He'd spent hours mending fence line in the heat, and his back ached with the kind of deep weariness that comes not just from physical labor, but from the accumulation of years. As twilight deepened, Thomas noticed movement near the creek that ran along his southern property line. He rose slowly from his chair and walked to the edge of the porch, shading his eyes against the slanting sun. 2 figures were there, and they seemed to be struggling with something. He made his way down the path worn smooth by decades of footsteps, and as he drew closer, he could see it was 2 young women, probably in their early 20s, and they were in some kind of distress. Their clothes were torn and dirty, and both were limping badly. One had blood on her leg, and the other was holding her arm at an odd angle. Thomas called out gently, not wanting to startle them, and they turned with expressions that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. The taller one, with dark hair matted with dust, tried to step forward protectively in front of her companion, but her injured leg gave way and she nearly fell. "Easy now," Thomas said in the same calm voice he used with frightened animals. "Looks like you 2 have had a rough time of it." The shorter woman with auburn hair falling across her face spoke first, and her voice trembled with exhaustion. "Our car went off the road about 5 miles back, and we've been walking since noon trying to find help." Thomas nodded slowly, taking in their condition without judgment. That stretch of highway can be treacherous if you don't know it, and there's not much traffic this time of day. He could see they were cold despite the warmth of the evening, and shock was probably setting in from their injuries and the ordeal of the long walk. Without hesitation, he said, "Let's get you both up to the house and we'll tend to those wounds." The dark-haired woman named Sarah, as he would learn later, looked at him with wariness, born from experiences he could only imagine. "We don't want to be any trouble, and we can pay you for your help." Thomas shook his head gently. "No talk of payment needed, and you're not any trouble at all." He could see the moment when something shifted in their eyes when they chose to trust him, and it reminded him of the countless times he'd earned the trust of wild creatures through patience and gentleness. The auburn-haired woman, who later told him her name was Emily, began to cry quietly, and Thomas pretended not to notice, giving her the dignity of her tears. The walk back to the house was slow and careful, and Thomas let them set the pace. His dog, Buck, an old border collie with graying muzzle, came down to investigate, and after a cautious sniff seemed to sense the situation required his gentle side. He walked alongside Emily as if understanding she needed the comfort of his presence. Inside the house, Thomas guided them to the large kitchen where his grandmother's table still stood solid and welcoming. He pulled out chairs and helped them sit, then set about gathering supplies from the cabinet where he kept medical necessities. Ranch life had taught him basic first aid, and his hands, though rough, were steady and kind. "Let's have a look at that leg," he said to Emily, and she nodded, pulling up the torn fabric of her jeans. The cut was deep but clean, and Thomas cleaned it carefully with antiseptic, murmuring apologies when she winced. As he worked, he kept up a gentle stream of conversation about nothing in particular, the way the meadowlarks had been singing that morning, and how the old apple tree by the barn was heavy with fruit this year. Sarah watched him work on her friend, and gradually the tension in her shoulders began to ease. When he turned his attention to her arm, he moved with the same careful respect, asking permission before touching and explaining what he was doing. It wasn't broken, as they'd feared, but badly sprained, and he wrapped it securely with bandages from his kit. "You'll want to see a proper doctor tomorrow," he told them, "but this should hold you through the night." Emily looked up at him with eyes that held a vulnerability that made his heart ache. "We can't go back," she said quietly. "Not yet, anyway." Thomas didn't press for details, and instead he stood and moved to the stove. What you both need right now is hot food and rest, and we can figure out the rest come morning. He made soup from scratch the way his mother had taught him 60 years ago, with vegetables from his garden and beef from his own cattle. The kitchen filled with warmth and good smells, and slowly the two young women began to relax. They ate hungrily, and he refilled their bowls without comment, understanding that nourishment was about more than just food. As they ate, Sarah began to talk, and the story came out in pieces. They had been fleeing from a situation back east where Sarah's ex-husband had become dangerous and controlling. Emily was her sister, and they'd packed what they could fit in an old car and driven west, hoping to start fresh somewhere no one knew them. The accident had felt like the final blow in a long series of misfortunes. Thomas listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he simply said, "You're safe here, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "We're not charity cases," she said with quiet dignity. "We can work and we can earn our keep." "I don't doubt that for a moment," Thomas replied. "But tonight let's just focus on rest and healing, and tomorrow we can talk about what comes next." He showed them to the guest room that had been his mother's, and the bed was made up with quilts she'd sewn decades ago. Fresh towels hung on the rack, and wildflowers he'd picked that morning sat in a jar on the dresser. It was a room that spoke of care and welcome without words. That night, as Thomas lay in his own bed listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch, settling into darkness, he thought about the strange way life brings people together. He'd woken that morning with no idea that two souls in need would find their way to his door, and yet somehow it felt right and purposeful. Over the following days, a gentle routine established itself. Sarah's arm healed slowly, and Emily's leg mended with the resilience of youth. Thomas showed them around the ranch, explaining the daily rhythms, and they began to help where they could. Sarah had a way with the chickens, and soon the flock was producing better than they had in years. Emily discovered she had a talent for working with the horses, and even the most skittish mare gentled under her patient hands. Thomas watched them grow stronger, not just in body but in spirit, and he saw how the simple work and open spaces began to heal something deeper than their physical wounds. They laughed more as the days passed, and the hunted look faded from their eyes. One evening, about 2 weeks after they'd arrived, Thomas was working in the barn when he heard raised voices. He came around the corner to find Sarah and Emily in their undergarments standing by the water trough, and they were clearly distressed. Thomas stopped immediately, averting his eyes, and was about to retreat when Sarah called out. "Wait," she said, and her voice held a note of desperation. "We're taking it off." Thomas turned back, confused and keeping his gaze respectfully high. Sarah was pulling at something under her tank top, and Emily was doing the same. They were wearing some kind of restrictive undergarments, he realized, and they looked painful against their skin. "These were supposed to help us look different," Emily explained. "We thought if we changed our appearance, it would be harder for anyone to recognize us, but they're awful and they hurt." Sarah nodded. "We've been wearing them for weeks and we just can't anymore, but we didn't want you to think we were being inappropriate in your home." Thomas understood then the layers of fear and shame they'd been carrying, and his heart went out to them. He turned his back to give them privacy and spoke gently. "This is your home too for as long as you're here, and you should be comfortable and be yourselves." He heard the relief in Emily's voice when she said, "Thank you for understanding, Thomas," smiled to himself, though they couldn't see it. "I raised cattle for 40 years, and one thing I learned is that every creature does better when they're not bound up in something that doesn't fit." The simplicity of his acceptance seemed to break something open in both women, and later that evening, as they all sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Sarah spoke about things she'd never told anyone, about the years of walking on eggshells and the slow erosion of self that happens when you live in fear. Emily talked about the guilt she felt for not seeing it sooner and not being able to protect her sister. Thomas listened with the patience of someone who understands that healing requires witness, and he offered no easy platitudes or quick solutions. Instead, he shared his own story of loss when his parents had died within Mo.